If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. Late night drivers and truckers. What eerie or strange experiences, otherworldly sights, or encounters have you had on rural or forest roads, haunted highways, or in isolated areas in the middle of nowhere? First, I had never heard of a Dogman. Prior to finding out these sightings were called Dogman, I had only thought to search for werewolf-like creatures. When I finally found out the correct name, I googled it, and I found a sighting story from Niagara Falls that happened in the 60s, which is only about 30 minutes from me. The details were so similar to our experience, it felt like I'd copied and pasted their experience. But I assure you, this is a 100% truthful personal experience, and I wouldn't have believed my eyes if I'd been alone. The story. It was July 19, 2016. I remember the date because we had our annual Christmas in July with my in-laws. And it was a crazy full moon. We had left to head home. The time was approximately 11:30 p.m. EST. We took the back way. We live in a somewhat rural area, so the back way is very dark, there is no traffic at that time of night, and the speed limit is 60 kilometers per hour. As we're driving along, and about 5 minutes from home, out of the corner of my eye, towards the forest on the passenger side, I catch a glimpse of something moving fast. The moment my foot hits the brake, my wife's hand grabs my leg. Getting goosebumps as I type this as it was a crazy experience. We come to a screeching halt in the road, and whatever it was stopped dead in front of us. It cocked its head to look at us. We both at the same time said, "Do you see that?" It was huge. Best guess, 7 feet tall, it had yellow eyes that glowed from the headlights. And it was muscular and skinny at the same time. The most memorable feature though were its legs. It 100% looked like a dog walking upright with the cocked angle in its leg. No sooner did it stop and glare at us, did it continue to bolt across the road and vanish into the forest on my driver's side. The only way we have ever been able to describe it was werewolf-like. And like I said, my wife and I both agreed. If we had not both witnessed it, I'd have called myself crazy and never mentioned it. But we both saw it. This is one of those stories you wish wasn't true. Later, when you're in bed at night, you'll think of it again and try to convince yourself it wasn't true. Next time you drive alone at night, you'll think of it. It's just a story. But here's the thing, it is. That's the worst part, it was a dark summer night, now darker in my memory. The full moon was the only light on that lonely Texas highway. I was driving with the window slightly open, and the smell of damp earth filled my car. Texas is hot, even at night, and I could feel the dampness of my skin finding relief in the wind blowing by me at 70 miles an hour. I couldn't stop looking at the moon. It was bigger than I'd ever seen. I was trying to keep my eyes on the road, but I was fixated. My mind flashed images of my mother telling me stories of the man on the moon, and I smiled to myself at the thought. The moon was so big I might have actually seen the man. My smile faded all too quick as I thought of a man actually living on the moon, the loneliness that he must feel. My brain is habituated to turning everything dark. I must have been zoned out for a full minute because I was startled by my car driving over the highway's rumble strips. I decided to stop thinking about such depressing things and tried to blast happy music and focus on the feeling of freedom that accompanied the deserted Texas road. Suddenly something caught my eye. To be completely honest, I totally ignored it and didn't think twice. I just kept driving. It was there again. I saw something out of the passenger side window. Was I imagining things? I swear I saw a shadow running next to my car. That's impossible, though, because no one can keep up with a moving vehicle. Suddenly, in the midst of my thoughts, I saw it clearly. It was a shadow. It didn't have any discernible features, but it was definitely running. My eyes kept darting to my right, just barely not catching it every time. Was this thing aware? Without realizing it, I was speeding. This thing was keeping up. I was starting to panic. I was suddenly hyper-aware of how alone this highway was. How bright the moon was. How fast was I going? How fast was it going? I turned to get a look, highway be damned, and I saw the teeth. I slammed the brakes hard and heard the car come to a screeching halt. I was hyperventilating. What the duck was that? I turned my lights on, and I saw nothing. I convinced myself I made it up. The full moon had my imagination going full speed, I'm sure. The loneliness of the highway got to me. I'm just so exhausted, I'm seeing things. I told myself everything you possibly could. Eventually I got the nerve to start driving again. I closed the windows and turned on cruise control. By the time I got home that night, I climbed into bed without a second thought. The next morning I was awakened by the smell of coffee, and in a haze I stepped into the kitchen to greet Alex. "Hey, did you run into something last night?" "What? Why would he say that?" I didn't tell anyone about what I saw. There's some crazy scratches on your car. Are you alright? I felt the blood drain from my face. The words were not processing. It just wasn't possible. Hey. Hello? Are you okay? I started towards the door, expressionless. I had to see for myself. There was no convincing myself of what's true this time. My dad's driving story. In a nutshell, he recounts a story about a time when he and his friend were driving on a road in Elkton, Maryland. This was a good 25 plus years ago. Then 5 seconds later they were on the other side of the canal in Delaware. Which was about 30 minutes away from the road they were on, which made no sense. They looked behind them, and the road was just covered in dust like a dry dirt road. They both were not drinking or doing drugs. Both had the same recollection of that happening. Both agreed it made absolutely no sense they were here. Both of them actually sought therapy for this issue for a brief period. But nothing ever came of it. A few years ago, me and my dad were driving late at night to a house we were meant to be staying at. We had never been there before, so we had the sat-nav on to get there. It must have been about 11 or 12 at night when we came to a small rural village. This was slightly strange, as we hadn't seen any homes for about an hour. The route we were taking was almost completely rural, so this was kind of weird. The village was fairly small, maybe 100 homes looking like they'd been built in the 50s, mostly semi-detached 2-story homes. Some lights were on, and we passed 3 separate people walking down the street. We thought this was strange due to it being almost midnight. The sat-nav voice hadn't given any directions in a while. This is where things got weird. My dad, who was driving, asked me to check the voice was turned on, and this is when I saw that there was no evidence of any homes or roads apart from the one we were on. But we could see several roads leading off this one. Though slightly creeped out, we just put it down to not having updated the sat-nav map in a while and brushed it off as a malfunction. We forgot about it and drove about half an hour to our destination. We stayed at the house overnight and in the morning drove home. We left the village the house was in and had been driving again, through almost totally rural roads. Half an hour had passed, and we remembered the village we passed through and were expecting it to be coming up soon. But it never did. We were totally confused, and when we got home, we compared the 2 routes, there and back, on the sat-nav. They were exactly the same. We had driven the same route there and back. What was this village? Where has it gone? Why hadn't it shown up on the sat-nav, and who were the people walking the streets? This has confused us ever since, and no one has ever been able to come up with a reasonable solution. This happened 2 years ago. My then boyfriend and I went on a road trip in Laguna, a province in the Philippines. There is a huge university located next to a mountain called Mount Makiling, named after a local deity. It's a popular campsite especially for the Boy Scouts, and my ex, who was a Boy Scout, driving for a good solid hour, we ended up back in the university, on the same road that we started. It baffled us because again, we made no turns, we followed a map, and if we had made a mistake, we would have seen the big landmarks on the way back. I started freaking out. X was also on the verge of freaking out but said that maybe we shouldn't talk about it. We ended up taking an alternate route away from the mountain to get back to the city. I've since then looked at the map over and over, and I still can't explain how it could have happened. Then again, a lot of weird things happen on that mountain, especially to the campers. I am an older lady and an over-the-road truck driver. I was driving late one night about 50 to 60 miles north of Albuquerque when I noticed something very large and pale sitting high up on a pole to my right. As I got closer, it took off in flight. Its wingspan looked abnormally huge. It appeared owl-like. As it swooped down on the truck, I sped up, hoping to avoid a collision, but to no avail. It hit the passenger side of my windshield with such force that the glass fragmented from top to bottom, with fractures extending completely across the windshield. I was looking directly at it when it hit. Instead of leaving a blood trail as it slid up the window, it exploded into what appeared to be dust. I was in complete shock. It was now difficult to see clearly out of the windshield, even on the driver's side. I was overcome with a feeling of dread. I slowed down, thinking for a moment I should stop when a cold, fearful feeling replaced the dread. I said a quick prayer and drove several miles down the road until I found a wide shoulder to pull over. I sat for a few minutes gasping as the fear subsided a bit. I knew I had to find a place to fix the truck's windshield, so I picked up my cell phone and Googled glass repair shops near me. The closest location that could handle large trucks was a little south of Albuquerque. I made a call, hoping they had voicemail so I could leave details about the truck make and model and my cell phone number. I was very surprised when a woman answered this late at night. She was very accommodating, even offering an overnight parking space that could fit a semi-truck and trailer at their business location. It was difficult to see out the windshield making turns, but I was able to find the location and park there for the night. My dog did not want to get out when we arrived, which I found odd, but I was too exhausted and stressed to question it. In the morning, when the glass shop opened, I let my dog out and went inside to arrange payment. When I returned to the truck, my thoughts were on removing everything on the dash to prepare for the installation. To my surprise, I noticed above the broken glass, extending up onto the roof, a thick white streak that looked like paint or heavy chalk. I had no idea what it was, but it did not seem possible an owl could leave a mark like that. A returning feeling of apprehension came over me as I reflected on the owl creature turning to dust after it struck the window last night. Could that have been a skinwalker instead of an owl? Over the next several months many things happened to the truck on the passenger side, mechanical failures, tire failures, and I was also hit by another truck on that side while parked. It leaves me in wonder to this day. For those of you who don't know, Riverdale is an 11-mile stretch of road in Colorado. Supposedly, it's one of the scariest places in the state. Some reported events from the road include a ghost Camaro racing people along the twisting back road, the ghost of a jogger who was killed in a hit and run, and a lot of demonic activity. I've lived near this road, it's about 2 or 3 miles from me, for a while, and I've only driven down it a couple times. However, the times that I have driven down it, I've always had this sensation that there is something in my car with me. These sensations usually start a decent distance down the road, around the E470 overpass, and tend to dissipate shortly after exiting the road. These weird feelings have sparked the thrill seeker in me, and I decided to start actually investigating the road. The first thing I decided to do was just drive down the road and stop near the E470 overpass to see if anything happened. At first, nothing happened, and I started to feel like an idiot just sitting in my car under a bridge. However, after about 5 minutes of nothing, I started to hear a faint sound of shoes hitting pavement. I looked around and in my mirrors, expecting to see some crazy person going on a late-night run, but there was no sign of anyone. The sound grew louder and louder, until it sounded like it was right outside of my car, and then it just faded away. This freaked me out enough to make me start my car and drive home. On the drive home, I kept thinking I saw figures out of the corners of my eyes, hidden in the trees, and dark handprints on the road signs. I decided it was my imagination and drove home. Later in the week, I decided to go back and try to get a video of some of the weird stuff you can find. I was expecting to get stuff like dead animals that look like they were sacrificed and maybe some nasty looking road signs, but that wasn't quite what I got. I've been driving ever since then. I went through the E470 overpass and kept driving, but I haven't reached any other places to turn off in 5 days. Every once in a while, I pull off of the road, into the dirt, to sleep, or to see if I can get my location with my phone, but it isn't working. The weirdest part is that, despite my GPS, and my compass, for that matter, not working, it seems like I have internet, and my phone's battery hasn't gone down at all, nor has my car's gas. Whole day of driving and using my phone, and the battery and gas tank are both full. I'm getting worried that I may never get off of this road. I panicked, began to pray, and focused intensely on finding a way out of this loop. Suddenly, a new turn appeared, one I hadn't encountered in my loop for a long time. It felt like a wormhole or a portal had pushed me out, as if whatever it was had had enough fun with me, and then it just let me go. I don't know what it was, but trust me, I'm never going there again. No, thank you. Why I don't like driving on country roads at night. A few years ago, my sister decided to have a surprise 30th birthday for her husband. Since he missed his senior prom, she decided to make that the theme of the party and even booked the same hall his prom was hosted in when he was a teenager. Problem is, my brother-in-law grew up in basically the middle of nowhere, a small, rural Missouri town that you have to leave the highway and travel down about 5 miles of heavily wooded backroads to get to. On top of being so isolated, there's a rather large heroin problem out there, both using and dealing. It's a pretty potent cocktail, but my sister was determined to have the party there. The party was at 6, and my original plan was to drive out with my sister and her friends to help set up. My sister was heavily pregnant at the time and needed all the help she could get, then drive back home with her. However, I got called into work and had to stay until 4, so I told my sister I would drive up by myself as soon as I was done. She warned me that it was pretty easy to get turned around on those country roads, but I had maps to help me and didn't worry about it. The drive up was fine. It was late September, my favorite time of year, and the scenery was surprisingly pretty. I found the place, no problem, and helped with some last-minute setup before my brother-in-law showed up. The party was a lot of fun and lasted until about 11, when the hall closed. I was one of the last people to leave, having stayed behind to help my sister and her friend stack chairs. My brother-in-law had overindulged at the open bar and had to be driven home by his friend. We ended up not actually heading out until almost midnight, and by that point, I was exhausted. My sister once again warned me about being careful on the back roads, but I'd gotten up there okay, so I wasn't too concerned about the drive home. I hugged her goodbye, hopped into my car, and started working my way back to the highway. Unfortunately, in my sleepy state, I misjudged which road I was supposed to turn off as I reached the exit for the highway and ended up turning down an entirely different road that ran parallel to it instead. It was yet another heavily wooded and narrow back road. I started looking for somewhere I could pull in to turn around. After driving maybe 200 yards, I spotted a gravel embankment and decided to pull in there so I could get turned around. I pulled in and made a sharp U-turn so I could head back up the road, and as I lifted my head to check no one was coming, I saw it in my driver's side mirror, a figure in a dark blue t-shirt and jeans, with long black hair and a pale face, illuminated in my brake lights. My heart jumped into my throat as I gasped in fright. But after a second of pure panic, I realized that the pale face was actually a mask, one of those cheap plastic white ones you get at costume stores. I immediately felt like an idiot. It was almost October, so obviously this was a Halloween decoration. This embankment likely led to someone's driveway, and the family who lived there probably had tons of things just like it in their yard. I took a moment to unclench my hands from the steering wheel and let my heart rate get back to normal, and I ended up catching a glimpse of the thing in my mirror again. And I noticed that the embankment didn't lead to a driveway. There was nothing else behind me but tall grass and trees. I briefly wondered why anyone would put a Halloween decoration out in the middle of nowhere. Then the decoration took a step forward. I slammed on the gas and shot forward, eventually getting back to the main road and onto the highway. I don't think I stopped shaking until I reached my town city limits half an hour later. Looking back, I definitely wasn't in any danger. I was in a car, all the doors were locked, and I could easily have run down whoever that creep was if they tried anything. If they'd gotten even one step closer when panic mode set in, that's probably what I would have done. It was probably just a kid or local druggie in a crappy mask, giving motorists a good scare and not really thinking about the consequences. But still, it was definitely one of the creepiest moments of my life, and I'm still nervous driving down secluded country roads at night these days. I was coming home from spending an evening in LA, live in OC, lived in LA for a bit, know the area and freeways really well, and have an excellent sense of direction, and found myself headed in the opposite direction of where I needed to be heading with no memory of switching to the northbound freeway. I was a little bit tired, but I vividly remember getting off of the main streets of the middle of the city and onto the southbound 101 freeway. My drive was around 40 minutes long at that point, Waze said so. All of a sudden I looked down at my phone, and my drive is over an hour long, after having been traveling for at least 20 minutes. I'm on the 405 North, which, for anybody who doesn't know, is miles and miles away from the 101 freeway. A jolt of energy went through my body as though I had just woken up, and I was absolutely freaked out. I was nearing LAX headed north, so I got off at the next exit and made a left and got onto the southbound 405. This was not the direction or even the same freeway that I was on for at least 20 minutes, and I have absolutely no clue how I got on this road. I started crying and flipping out but told myself to just relax and head home. I had to keep checking that I was going the right way. I was, finally. It was so freaky because I know these roads like I know every centimeter of my face. What do you think this could have been? How did I lose that time? Why do I remember those 20 minutes, watching the time of my drive decrease as I was approaching my destination, and then with the snap of a finger I was an hour away on a different freeway and in the wrong direction? I just wanted to get your thoughts on something that happened today. While I was driving on a highway, it felt like I almost hit something. For 1 second the window on my left got dark, like I drove pretty close, inches, to something big. During that moment I couldn't see anything else on my left. This thing covered the whole window. At first I thought it was nothing, but my wife got scared, quickly looked back, and asked, "What did you hit? Did you hit something?" There was no noise. Just the impression that something got extremely close to the car. I looked back through the mirror, and there was absolutely nothing on the road, no animals. The cars behind me didn't reduce their speed. Both me and my wife were just trying to understand what happened, because she also saw that thing with no specific shape that suddenly disappeared. She said it was something gray. She even joked, "Are we in the same dimension now? Did we come across some kind of portal? Do you think it was a skinwalker?" But, despite the jokes, what caught my attention was that this happened as we drove by the Red Rocks area, where some workers saw an unidentified aerial phenomenon recently. We are 100% sure it was not an animal or person, It was also not the shadow of a bridge or an airplane, it covered only one window, and, obviously, it was not another vehicle. Do you guys have any thoughts? Did you ever experience something similar? I was on a small road trip. My two friends and I were traveling across state lines to drop one of them off at home. It's later at night, very dark out, and no moon. We're driving down the highway with no cars around. We're running out of gas, so we pull over to a station. Fill up. This is when it gets weird. We start driving, and I glance at the clock. It's nearly 2 a.m., and this was maybe 15 years ago, so we only had the radio clock. This radio clock ducking sucked and would randomly just die on us. The whole radio would. We're driving down the road for maybe a half hour when we hit some fog, the radio starts going nuts and dies. We just shrug it off and keep driving. The place we were going to was only 2 hours away from the gas station, so we figured it wasn't a big deal and we would just chat. 2 hours pass. No cars. No lights. No gas stations. It was like we were nowhere that existed. The fog was still around too, and we were starting to get worried that maybe we got lost. We fussed with the radio some more to try to get it to turn on, but it wouldn't. After another hour of driving, we spot lights in the distance. It was a gas station. Suddenly, the fog lifted, and as we pulled into the gas station, we realized. This is the same. Ducking. Gas station. The radio turned on as we pulled up. 3 a.m. But we definitely went longer than that. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe we somehow went in a circle? Maybe this wasn't the same gas station? We got back in the car and left, but we never hit the fog again and made it to my friend's place in 2 hours. To this day, I think about that and can't explain it. It was the most bizarre thing that has happened to me. Anyway, thanks for listening. My dad is a poet and performer who frequently performs in bars using spoken word. He occasionally does something at these shows he calls the Book of Strange, which involves picking someone out of the crowd and enticing them to tell their craziest story. What is the strangest thing that ever happened to you? It seems like it would be awkward, but my dad really does have a knack for putting people at ease and drawing out the genuinely wacky stories that 99% of people have in their repertoire. This is basically the same thing, people describing unexplainable incidents. I even reported one of mine on here. So I figured I'd write out one of the stories that a man, a bland old government worker, like most people in the capital city we live in, told us one night at a local bar. The guy was in rural Central Africa doing development work for a period of months. He had been in a small, more remote village and was driving back to his house on a barely there dirt road through the middle of the savannah. It was nighttime, and the moon and stars were sparkling bright. As he drove, he saw something in the middle of the road. As he came up to it, he realized it was a donkey, a big, dusty donkey, completely unbothered by the car and refusing to move. The guy honked a couple times, then got out of the car to try to move it. Just as he was getting out of his car, he was hit by a massive wave of dusty particles. A sandstorm had come out of absolutely nowhere, and he quickly jumped back in his car for safety. He sat in his car for a few seconds as this extremely intense sandstorm passed the car, completely obscuring all the windows with thick clouds of brown dirt. The sandstorm passed as quickly as it had come. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then it was right back to a clear moonlit night. But with a big difference. The donkey was gone, and as the guy stepped out of his car, he realized that the road he was on was gone, and there was a gigantic cliff right in front of him, about as far as the donkey was from the car. If he had gone even a little further with his car, he would have hurtled off this precipice and fallen to his certain death. Gigantic drop. Was the donkey an animal guardian of some kind? Which was fake, the original landscape he saw or the cliff? He turned around and drove away. Pretty crazy story, eh? There's tons more where that came from, collected from some people who you really wouldn't think had stories like that under their belt. My friend, G, and I are spook junkies. We enjoy visiting haunted places to get a good scare. Our favorite place, though, is called the Third Bridge. If you are a native here, you know it. Crazy happenings, crazy stories, crazy places. We used to go there very often, just for late night fun. We know the roads well. It's very confusing, and very desolate for sure, and there are multiple ways to get there. But we know these roads from going over them so many times, and we always have the same GPS coordinates in our phones just to see what route it takes us because it's interesting how it changes sometimes. However, the last time we went, we experienced by far the weirdest and worst glitch that I have ever felt or experienced. Thinking about it absolutely terrifies me, to the point that I'm not sure I'll ever go back. I honestly wouldn't believe myself except he was there and had the same experience as I did. We went later than usual. We get on a particular slim dirt road that leads you to a curvier dirt road that leads to the bridges, and this first dirt road always gives us the shits. We don't know why, but the moment you pass the halfway mark, you just feel wrong? But this night was worse. Both of us felt it, but it's like our consciousness was completely fogged. We were in such a haze that we didn't even really recognize it, we just zoned out on this road. Next thing we knew, we were on the main, curved dirt road. It has bright yellow arrows on the left side where it bends. However, it didn't end. It was like every time we hit the end of the road, we teleported back to the beginning and drove down it again. The first few times, we said nothing, not really comprehending it. But then we came across it. A dead porcupine, in the middle of the road. This is important. Firstly, because his car clock and my phone clock were both the same time at the beginning of the night, and we believe it got distorted when I got out of the car here. And second, because I had to drag the massive dead porcupine to the side of the road before we could keep driving with my phone in my pocket. Without turning, only going down the curvy road, we passed this same dead porcupine at least 4 times. We knew we were going the same direction, too, because the signs are on the left and the porcupine is on the right. Same spot on the road. We never turned around. There wasn't even the chance either. The road is one lane with thick brush on both sides. Honestly, we started panicking when it set in. I looked at my phone. The car clock read 3 a.m. My phone read 5 a.m. This messed us up because we could have sworn only an hour had passed since we started on the first road at midnight. By the time the road let us go, we were horrified and took the first road away. We were not even going to try to get to the bridge. We were done and scared, but as we left the final dirt road, it felt like our minds cleared, and it really hit us. We haven't been back since then, and we don't talk about that night. At all. Except to call deer bunnies, because near the beginning of the night we saw what we both thought was a wounded deer because of its size, and it wasn't running like a deer, but it turned to look, and as we slammed on the brakes, it was the biggest ducking rabbit we had ever seen. Something super ducked up happened that night. I hate to think about it. Blue Lady Ghost. On a stretch of Highway 92 between San Mateo, California, and Half Moon Bay, which is a dangerous road that goes through the hills from the peninsula to the beach. The tale told to us and known to people in the area is if you're driving this road and you see a lady with a blue tint or glow around her, you have to pick her up or you will crash off the cliffs and die. People that have picked her up say she talks about how she has to get help because she was in a car accident and her kids were injured in the car. Then, before you know it, she will just vanish. Apparently she did exist and died on that road with her children. The road is windy and foggy. This story happened to a friend of mine. My friend described what he experienced as follows. Year, 1986. There was no electricity or road in the village. The villagers had to go to Elazığ, a city in Turkey, to meet their needs. The road to the center was 2 to 3 kilometers away from the village. It was necessary to be on this road at 4:30 a.m. to reach Elazığ. There was only one car that goes to Elazığ. The car was coming back around noon. The road used to go to Elazığ was called Sin Deresi, Demon Creek, by the villagers, and they thought that strange events were happening there and that it wasn't auspicious. Me and 2 of my friends started preparing at 3 p.m. to hit the road. The road we had to cross that included the Demon Creek to reach Elazığ was on our minds. First, we planned to cross the Ridgeway, then the Demon Creek and enter the highway that leads to Elazığ. Afterwards, we hit the road. We lit our cigarettes while driving. It was utter darkness. There wasn't even moonlight. We were slowly encouraging ourselves to cross the Demon Creek and thinking about that moment. We were getting close to Demon Creek, but first we had to cross the Ridgeway. The path was so narrow that 2 people could not walk side by side, and it was filled with big bushes. We were moving in a single line. I was the last one in the row. The first guy in the row named Kamal suddenly stopped, and he mentioned that there was a black dog watching us without moving on the way. I thought to myself, it's one of our village dogs. My friends were very nervous. We were getting more scared of the stories that we had heard since our childhood. I was scared and started reciting Bismillah, it's a Muslim prayer. The dog suddenly got out of the way and disappeared after moving a few meters away in the bushes. After the dog had disappeared, we thought to ourselves what the dog was doing there and continued to walk. After walking for 1 to 2 minutes, Kamal suddenly stopped again and yelled, "It's the same dog again, Hassan," before moving a few steps back. 3 of us didn't know what to do because of confusion and fear. The dog looked at us once more. I recited Bismillah again. The dog stood up and vanished again at the bushes. My friend said, "Hassan, let's go back and don't go there." And I said, "We need to cross this road. If we don't, we will have to tomorrow. We will use this road for shopping." And calmed them down, Then we continued to our path. My friends were scared. Of course do I. We were talking about why the dog appeared at us again. I tried to calm them down by saying it's just a common dog and following us. We continued on our path. We couldn't believe our eyes what we had seen after 3-5 minutes. A coal-black goat was standing on the road, seemingly blocking the way. We were so scared. We started to pray and recite Bismillah. The goat suddenly disappeared. Disappearing of the goat made me comprehend that these events weren't ordinary at all, and we got scared seriously, but going back was unnecessary. I calmed my nerves and went to the first row of the line, and I backed my friends. I was simultaneously praying and following our route. It was only a sharp corner left for the Demon Creek. We were shocked when we finished crossing the sharp corner. What we had seen was indescribable. Long, white as snow, shining silhouette, shape, mass. Whatever, it was obvious that it had arms and legs, but its face was ambiguous, and so it started to create sounds of rumbling, screaming, crying. We closed our ears with our hands. We were throwing ourselves out of fear and flapping on the ground. At the same time, there was blindly shining. I started to recite my known prayers. My friends were yelling and cursing, and they didn't know what they were doing. I was thinking about how to escape this situation and remain calm. I dragged my friends out of that situation. The screaming voices turned into laughter while we were escaping from there. The laughter echoed in our minds. We headed back to the village, but we didn't know how we could come back. At the entrance of the village, there was the house of Kamal. When Kamal's parents saw us, they couldn't believe their eyes. They said, "What's the matter with you? You have paleness in your face." We couldn't speak, trembling continuously and making noises like dummies. They informed our relatives. They also came here. They tried to grasp with the mind the situation. I rested for a while and drank some water and told them the story. The villagers were stunned. They told us to thank God that you could come in one piece. We thought that we saved ourselves, but from sunrise to sunset, for 40 days, we had heavy headaches, skin rash, and huge herpes in our lips. This happened to me many years ago, but it has seriously messed with me ever since. I was 26 or 27 at the time and lived in a rural area. The nearest town for any business or real shopping was a 20 to 25 minute drive from my house. One day I was making the family drive into town to do some shopping. Suddenly, on a tree-enclosed stretch of road, I realized I didn't know where I was. Thinking of a sort of road hypnosis, it made me a bit nervous, but not extremely so. Then I came through the trees, and there was a country store to my right. I didn't recognize the store but wondered how I could not. I decided in a split second to pull over and get a Coke to settle myself down, fully expecting that this would orient me to where I was. However, after pulling over and as I went through the front door, I realized I didn't know where the Coke machine would be, and it suddenly became very important to me that the person or people in the store didn't know that I didn't know where I was. The checkout counter was to the right. One of the old-timey ones, and a woman sat behind it, so I made a left, like I knew where I was going, and found the Coke machine after circling my way around the back of the store. I went to the counter to pay, still not recognizing the woman or the store, and left quickly through the front door. As I exited, I could see my car, certainly recognized it, and hurried to it. Now if this could possibly get any weirder, I got in the car and was once again facing the store. I looked up and suddenly totally remembered this country store, but it was not the store I had just been in. This store was one I had stopped at several times in the past but did not at all look like the store I had just stopped at on this trip, went in, and purchased a Coke from. It wasn't even the same type of building. Totally freaked out, I canceled my shopping trip, turned around, and drove back home. It was many years before I talked about this, and then only a couple of times, as I was afraid of appearing crazy and have only received blank stares when I did mention it. I do want to add that I've never done any form of drugs. I was a social drinker in my late teens and early 20s, but didn't drink at all at that point in my life. I had no history of mental illness, but after this incident I did develop panic attacks and a phobia of driving out of town by myself that I believe was caused by this and not the other way around, if that makes any sense. I truly would like to know if this has happened to anyone else. And even at this late date, I would love to have an explanation for it. There is an old road near where I live where an old mining town once sat. It's creepy and feels like you're being watched no matter where you're at. I decided to go to the road with a friend of mine after work, around 11 p.m. or so. We took the road and drove on it for a while, taking side roads and exploring when we wanted. Him and I crested a hill, and my car started to cut out. My radio began turning to different stations, and my headlights began to dim then return to full brightness. We both felt lightheaded, and he passed out. I struggled to stay conscious but blacked out for a few seconds. When I regained consciousness, my car was nearly in a ditch, so I corrected it and straightened it out. Our ears were ringing, and we felt sick. I continued to drive, but when I looked behind us in my rear view mirror, our town was nowhere to be seen. All we saw was an empty, dark spot where our town was. As we drove down the road, the landscape was different. It looked like no one even settled there. The road became more difficult to navigate, and the fences that were lining the road were gone. We had no idea where we were. The road and the surrounding area were foreign. My buddy decided to pull up his GPS to find where we were, and he had no signal. I tried as well since we have different cell carriers, and I had similar results. My car is equipped with an OnStar and an infotainment center, and I tried to pull us up on it. Nothing. My OnStar light was red, indicating that I had no signal to any cell tower. I still pushed the call button and was met with an error. We got confused, and we started to panic. There was nowhere for me to turn around and go back the way we came. We were stuck driving that creepy road. As time went on, my friends started to see campfires and teepees while I saw shadow people and horses. The road became a trail and became almost impassable. We couldn't go any faster than 10 miles per hour, sometimes 15 or 20. Our ears began to ring more, and the car became enveloped in fog and mist. When we came out of the fog, the road was then gravel. We had no idea what was going on or where we were at still. No cell signal, no OnStar, no GPS. Nothing. My car started to stutter, the lights dimmed, and my radio was all static, with voices every now and then. My onboard digital compass started reading north, then east, then southwest, then nothing. Suddenly we saw bright lights behind us, roaring up to my car, blinding us. Then, as quickly as they came, they went. Vanishing. At this point, my clock read 2 a.m. We tried to take a side road to try to get back to town, and I took the first immediate left. We continued down that road, then I took another left. As I did, we found that the road I just took was the same as the one previous. We then took a right turn, and again, it was the same road. It has the same trees, the same S-turn, everything. This had to have happened a dozen times. As we were making yet another turn, what looked to be a truck appeared behind us. Headlights that stood tall from the road, slightly dim like it was an older vehicle. They edged closer and closer to us until all I saw was headlights. It felt like it was chasing us off the road. We were panicking, screaming. We wanted off that road so bad. The fog started to roll in behind us, coming halfway up my car before the lights behind us began to get farther away, eventually disappearing. My radio started to get a signal, my phone buzzed with a notification, and my OnStar light went from red to green. The road we came to was the same one we were on before the hill. I turned right and hit the main road. We didn't talk the whole way back. I dropped him off at his house, and I went back to mine. That night I had a weird dream about a shadow figure in the middle of the road. My car was parked, and my headlights illuminated it. It was wearing a black trench coat made from a dark black material. It had a hood covering its head. It walked towards my car and stopped at my bumper. This thing took its hood off and revealed a skull with glowing red eyes. It pointed at me with a bony finger, and I woke up. I remember this dream like it actually happened. Like it was burned into my memory. My friend had a dream just like mine, except the figure pointed at him. This happened a year ago, and we didn't talk about it again until recently. What the hell happened? Where in the absolute ducking hell did we go? My brother-in-law was on his way to Joshua Tree National Park, California, recently and finally mustered up the courage to speak about this to my husband and me tonight when he came over to drop something off to my husband. He hesitated because he was scared that we would think he was crazy or making things up, but he's honestly never the person to lie. He's the most trustworthy person, and in all of the time I have known him, he has never once kept anything from my husband and me or told any lies, and he has no reason to. He was genuinely so freaked out to his core, and we know he's telling the truth. He's never had this look on his face before. He was driving alone in his car to go stargaze late at night, an astronomy buff, when everything flashed and he saw a very close, super bright white light hovering maybe 200 feet in front of his car. He slowed down and felt a bit freaked out but kept going, as he felt unexplainably drawn to it. As he got closer, he realized what looked to be a metallic cigar-shaped object. Once he speeded past it, he noticed that it began to slowly follow him from his rearview mirror, stopping at times before zigzagged closer and closer, as if it were stalking him like prey carefully getting ready to pounce. He said that he felt super freaked out at this point, and everything in his car suddenly felt charged with a huge amount of static electricity out of left field. All of his hair was sticking up, head, arms, entire body, and when he would touch his dashboard or other parts of the car, he would get shocked. He said he felt like he was being watched and followed. He had never been so scared in his life and immediately knew that this was not something of this earth. He went from full-on non-believer to legitimately believing that he was going to get abducted, but managed to convince himself that he was crazy during the encounter. It was as if an energy got lassoed onto his car, and he felt his car shaking and almost getting pulled towards the hovering object. He was struggling to get his car to move fast enough, but he finally was able to get it to stop acting weird. This is when he floored the pedal and went autobahn speeds out of there. The static electricity flowing through his entire car then slowly subsided. All night he still felt he was being followed and watched, even with the craft far out of sight and long gone. When he arrived back home, his car began locking and unlocking itself throughout the night in his garage, making the lock and unlock honk for hours. His keys were literally on his bedside table, and he wasn't pressing them. He went to investigate and could actually hear and see the door locks clicking up and down. It got to the point where he bent down and checked under and around his car for any possible tracking devices. Nothing. His car began doing the same thing suddenly when he was at our place, telling us about it. My husband got so freaked out that he tried to end the topic of conversation. Now he is asleep and I am unable to. This freaked me out to the core, and we now genuinely believe that my bill is currently being monitored by whatever it was he encountered that night. He's too terrified to report it as of right now. We're trying to get him to. It all happened so fast that he did not get any video evidence. He said we were in fight or flight mode and that he is still traumatized from that. We told him we knew he was telling the truth and believed him. He sighed with relief, but by the end of his story, his face was pale, and he looked like he had the life completely drained out of him. My husband and I also saw a bunch of fireballs hovering in the sky a few months back and have not noticed that or been able to explain it since either. I don't even know what to say or do, I guess, other than to tell this story, and tell you that this is all very super real, and it's very horrifying. He's telling the truth. It's time for disclosure. I absolutely have to get this out because, as time passes, I'm afraid I won't be able to recall all the details. First, let me tell you a few things. 1. I am a very sane and sober single mother of a 7-year-old with severe autism, nonverbal. 2. Having a child who is completely nonverbal, you have to learn other ways to communicate. I have been told on more than one occasion that my son and I have our own form of communication. 3. I had a very normal pregnancy with the exception of one thing. I had him at 37 weeks by C-section because I had a very mild form of placenta previa. For those of you who don't know what that means, you have to deliver the baby first, then placenta, or it puts you both at risk. When you have previa, your placenta doesn't move back for the baby to come first, so to avoid the risk, you have a C-section. Now here's the weird stuff. About a month ago, on a Sunday night, my son was staying with his dad, so me and a friend of mine decided to go for a drive around the city and downtown area because it was nice outside. Nothing weird, right? We are driving around with the windows down and talking, and all of a sudden we both were literally hit with a feeling almost like how it feels when you drop on a roller coaster. That weightless feeling. I even made a sound like the breath had been knocked out of me. This feeling was accompanied by the sound of a shock wave, maybe? But not near as loud, not by half, and a metallic smell. It didn't hurt but just felt weird. I don't know how or why, but we both knew immediately what had just happened. We had driven through a time portal. Everything looked different but the same. Things were just slightly different, colors and sounds. Not fully understanding what had just happened, we both decided that perhaps if we drove back, we could return to our original location. Now at this point, let me say we were laughing about it, but you could feel tension because I'm pretty sure we both thought the other was a little crazy but didn't want to say it. As we headed back where we first felt it, we could actually feel the energy and smell it as we got closer. As we rounded the corner, the exact same thing happened again. In a split second, we drove through this thing for the second time. I became/saw through the eyes of a 12-year-old girl, not a former me, someone else who I don't know, walking toward a restaurant in that area that had a huge kid sculpture in front of it. After we came out of whatever the hell we drove through, I was able to recall the name of the restaurant and exactly what the sculpture looked like. As we were driving back, I decided to Google the name of the restaurant and the sculpture, and OMG, it was there. It had closed in 2007. I didn't even live in this city in 2007, nor have I ever seen what I saw in that moment. So how does the beginning of my story tie into this? Well, we get home, and I decide to text my son's father just to check in on things, and he said that my son had been quite upset for about an hour, like meltdown stemming crazy upset. Now let me say yes, he has meltdowns, but after 7 years of this, his dad and I have been able to, for the most part, figure out his triggers, and we communicate often about what helps/makes things worse. He said my son was inconsolable, so I decided to drive over and check on him. When I got to his apartment, my son literally bolted to me. He has never done that in his life. After about 30 seconds, he stopped crying and went back to playing like nothing ever happened. I didn't want to say anything to his dad about what had just happened to me because we co-parent, but I'm quite certain he would have me committed if I told him something like that. So not wanting to make a big deal about things, I decided to let him stay and went home and completely lost my shit. I cried for an hour or so and went to sleep. Since that night, nothing has been the same. I mean, it is, but not at the same time. I've never heard my son call me mom or say anything, and since that night and all of this has happened, he started trying to get words out. He's so upset because he wants to tell me something and he can't. We've tried for hours, and he can't. What is going on? I am so afraid. You can see it in my son's eyes. I'm so worried for him and I both, but please know that I will defend my child until death, and someone would surely have to kill me if I ever felt he or I were being threatened in any way. Now there is another part of this story that I want to say because I am overcome with certain feelings in the literal sense. Since 2012, not sure why that year, I've felt like something isn't right, but I can't ever put my finger on it. Again, like things are the same but aren't. I'm so afraid to put this out here in fear you are all going to think I'm insane, but hell, maybe you guys can help me sort this out, and I could be way off, but I don't know what else to think. The following happened in late July 1989, I was 24 years old. I live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. My girlfriend and I planned to attend my cousin's wedding in Vancouver, British Columbia. I would drive my car from Winnipeg, and as she worked for an airline in Vancouver, she would fly, and we would rendezvous in Calgary. I headed out on the Trans-Canada Highway just after midnight. My girlfriend admitted she was a little nervous to have me driving by myself, so I devised a plan so I could contact her to let her know I was okay. Cell phones were scarce back then, so I would stop at payphones along the way and call collect. She would not accept the charges, but she would know that I was okay. We met in Calgary, drove through beautiful Banff, and arrived at the wedding. It was warm in Revelstoke, and the wedding was spectacular, with picturesque mountains all around us. We left the next day for Edmonton, where we had a fantastic day at West Edmonton Mall on the waterside. She would catch a flight back to Vancouver, and I would start my drive back to the Peg. Again, along the way, I would stop and use pay phones to let her know I was good. It was about 3 a.m. on a very dark night with hardly a moon when I thought I'd get out to wake up a bit, stretch my legs, and use the pay phone. I saw an orange street light illuminating a phone booth. I turned down the service road and parked about 5 meters from the phone. It had cooled off quite a bit, and I can remember getting a chill down my back, looking at the amazing stars. Tucked behind trees and thick bushes, I could hear a dog barking in the distance. There must have been a farmhouse behind, I thought. The highway was set higher than the service road I was on and positioned about 15 meters from the phone booth. As I stretched my back and legs, I could hear the dogs barking intensify. I was alone. There was no one on the road, and the air was still, except for the dog. I opened the accordion folding doors and picked up the receiver to make my call. I dialed the number and turned slowly around to face the highway. My fatigued eyes tried to focus on what I was seeing, as my mind was having a difficult time trying to comprehend. 3 very large entities coming over top of the highway, converging toward the phone booth. The way they moved was horrifying. Their legs were tucked behind them, and they floated 1 meter off the ground as one landed right beside the booth. I tried to yell but couldn't. I tried to move but felt frozen. The only thing I could move were my eyes. I looked up horrified and saw this ugly, evil-looking thing looking down at me. I remember the big black empty eyes and deformed skull with the light from the booth illuminating its veins and pulsating. It must have been at least 3 meters tall. It reached down with its 1 thumb and 2 elongated fingers and pushed on one of the panes of glass. I don't remember breathing but more hyperventilating at this point. I must have begun to pass out when it started pushing at the accordion door. The next thing I remember was driving on the highway. I didn't know where I was just moving. I don't remember getting into my car, I was just relieved to be driving. Okay. I am aware that there will be negative comments directed towards me. Say I'm seeing shit. Say I'm dumb. Or high. But I got a good story for you. I was driving with my team at the time. It was summertime, and I was in South Carolina. I was working at a yard in Charleston at night. This drop yard was inside of a tow yard and had room for 10 of our trailers in the back. Therefore, it was merely a dirt lot situated at the rear of a somewhat shady tow yard. Nothing special, but this is relevant. So I roll up there at around midnight to drop and hook a trailer, then get rolling. Now mind you, it's pitch black out, and there's no lights in this back area. Off to my right-hand side near the trailers, I see a bobtail tractor with what looks like the dome light and sleeper berth inside lights on. You know those LEDs? I didn't think anything of it, maybe it was one of the company trucks. So, I get parked. And I just have this weird-ass feeling. It's like something's wrong. Like something bad is here. Like something bad is watching me. Man, I step outside the tractor, and I just feel weird. Shit's wrong. And I look at the bobtail tractor, and the lights are off now. And I shine my flashlight at it, and it's actually wrecked. It looked like the right steer tire blew. And the front end was ducked. When initially rolled up, those lights were on, and no one was in the front seat or back, or shit from what I could see. But after I parked, those lights were off. Now I don't think any crackheads were living in the truck. This yard was secured pretty good. Big ass gate to get in and security lets you in. I am on my way to drop off the trailer. Yada. I'm in the back of the trailer, fiddling with the load straps or something similar. And I still feel weird as hell the whole time. Well, when I went to my truck, my co-driver said, if you wanted to wake me up, then you should come in and say my name and get me, don't tap on the glass. I never tapped on the glass. My co-driver said they heard a faint tap on the glass in a pattern with the fingers. Like 1 2 3 4 quickly over and over. I never tapped on the glass. I never tried to wake them up. I was working in the back of the trailer. So I told them everything I just felt and saw. The light being on and off and shit. And how I feel like something evil is watching me. And the co-driver tells me that just before they woke up, they were having a nightmare. They pictured a witch in a swamp. Like one of those bayou swamps. And a witch was outside her house calling my co-driver into the house. And what woke my co-driver up was the tapping on the windows. So after all of this, we both are freaking out. Like what the duck? I even drove the truck around in a loop, trying to recreate my headlights shining on the bobtail. But it didn't look the same as when I pulled in. Me and my partner were heading to the movies one day. You see, I live in Orlando, and usually movie theaters are close by or 20 minutes away. We love going to one specific one due to the area, shopping and food. Me and him are on our way, and we know where to turn off because it's just a straight shot, a turn, and that's it. We know where to turn because of a huge Golden Corral and a Wendy's next to it. Boom, from Terrace the Plaza area. But today was different. We were talking, and usually my partner is very attentive to the roads, but we just kept driving. Didn't see the Wendy's or GC at all. We were a bit confused as the big city buildings and roads around us turned into a two-way highway with a bunch of woods and shrubs and only a few cars coming and going with a weird haze. Me and him get a bit freaked out, like, where are we? Like, everything happened so fast to the point where we felt as if we were on the countryside of Florida. I tried to shrug it off as maybe we missed our turn. I turned on GPS, and it started to say the movie theater, which was only 15 minutes from our house, turned into 35 minutes to the movies from the location we were on the road. Me and him, to say the least, were a bit perplexed. We knew something wasn't right, so he turned off and did a U-turn, no cars at all now. We rode in silence until we saw city streets and a bunch of Orlando traffic. We finally see the Wendy's and GC and turn off. We parked and just sat there for a bit. We looked at each other, and my partner told me, I don't know where we just went. I agreed and noticed that we missed our movie time and that we've been gone for 35 to 40 minutes, when it only felt so short to us. I could easily say it was just us missing our turn, but something didn't sit right in our heads. Even when me and him talk about it, it feels weird. I just wanted to know if this has happened to anyone, or anyone experiencing weird glitches in Florida. On July 2nd, at about 1:15 a.m., me and my brother decided to go on a late-night drive. My brother set the GPS to a random road in the forest. As we're driving in the forest, everything is going fine. We see a couple deer, a skunk, nothing out of the ordinary. Yes, it is a little creepy because we're driving through the forest at night. We were approaching a U-shaped part of the road. The incident occurred just before the road's curve. Now it's around 1:45 a.m. We've been driving in the forest for about 20 to 30 minutes. Everything was fine, and we felt fine, but in an instant, my brother, who is driving, immediately had bad vibes. He has a terrible feeling about this specific part of the road. He felt like crying, and his voice was trembling. As he was feeling like this, I couldn't move. My entire body had the queasy stomach feeling from head to toe. The feeling in your stomach when you are nervous or very anxious. All I could do was look ahead to the road. As I was frozen, my brother slammed the brakes and made a 3-point turn and zoomed out of there. But I didn't see us leave the area. I was having a vision. It seemed very real, as if it were a dream. I see us continuing to drive on the road and curve around on the U-shaped road. On the other side of the U, I see a ghost in a white dress, just standing in the middle of the road. That's when the vision ended and I could finally see what was actually happening. I just see that we are speeding down the road to get out of the forest as fast as possible. I don't know how or why I saw what didn't happen. It's like I was in an alternate reality where we do continue the road. Me and my brother are thinking that my guardian angel was showing me what would have happened. The guardian angel is a whole other story, but it makes sense to us. Once we get out of the forest, we park in the city to collect ourselves and process what just happened. We have never heard of this place and never want to go back there. A night that was supposed to be a peaceful night drive turned into a nightmare. Last summer, I had one of the most disturbing experiences I've ever had. I don't really like to talk about it, as it was a very dark time and some might find it difficult to believe, but this is a place for people who would actually hear me out. So here goes. I'm a college student from Kentucky. Last summer, I was supposed to do an internship with a wildlife rehab, but the guy bailed on me 2 days before, so I had to stay over the summer and work at my campus job on the college farm. It worked out though, because my girlfriend and I had gotten a house off campus for the next school year, so we didn't have to live in our crappy dorms, that were also haunted, but that's another story. I moved our stuff in at the beginning of the summer and unpacked, while my girlfriend went to her home in NC to make some money at her old waitressing job. It was a little lonely, especially since I have depression and anxiety, but I managed the best I could. About midway through the summer, I decided to take a week off and go visit her. We had fun, but my memory of that week is completely overshadowed by the ride home. The trip back to campus from her home is pretty easy. You take the highway out of the mountains and stay on it until Knoxville, Tennessee, then stay on the next highway until I reach my campus. It's pretty straightforward, but I usually have a GPS on anyways because I'm fairly forgetful. I left pretty late, around 11 p.m. I had already taken my exit in Knoxville and was on the straight stretch home. I was jamming out to some music when I realized that the turn on my GPS was different. In fact, there wasn't a turn at all. The highway just ended. That should not happen. That highway goes well past my college into Lexington, about 40 minutes past it. I thought maybe I had taken the wrong turn, although I swore I never turned, and didn't think much of it. The backroads of central Kentucky are pretty intense, with sharp curves and treacherous turns, so I was driving quite cautiously. By this point, it was 3 a.m., and I hadn't seen a single soul on the road. I finally get to an intersection outside of this super small town that I don't think even is named, no signs, nothing. Suddenly, my music cuts to static. I have an older car, so I have to use an FM transmitter that I plug into my cigarette lighter and tune to an empty station. It just became static. I looked down at it with shock, thinking it might have just jostled around and disconnected, but it was still connected. I tried to change the station to a better one, but all of them were static. I flipped through every single one until I finally found one, but I wished I hadn't. It was a really old sounding recording, like 30s 40s era, of church organ music. Suffice to say it gave me the creeps, so I just turned it off. Sitting at an intersection, I looked up at the town ahead of me and noticed that it looked very, vintage. It looked like this town was stuck in the 60s. The buildings, the tiny fire department, the one pump gas station on the corner, it was very uncanny. The place was like a ghost town. Not a single person or vehicle. Though it looked vintage, the town itself was very clean and looked in good shape despite the aesthetic. Then I noticed the fire truck at the fire department was not of this decade. It looked like, you guessed it, 50s 60s era. I drive through the town, completely baffled. No stoplights, only the 2 stop signs. But as I left, I felt something strange come over me. A feeling of dread and a feeling of being followed. I drove quickly to my next turn. Nothing prepared me for this shit. The roads narrowed to the point where my Trailblazer took up the entire road. The Mennonite country. But this one, well, it was different. Usually they have reflectors on the back, required by law, I think, but this one had none. No lights at all. It's not even a lantern. The buggy and its horses were black. I slowed down and overtook it, glancing at its passengers, an Amish man and his wife. Both stared me down. I'm talking eye contact. Thoroughly scared at this point, I hastened. But then I saw another one of these, and another. Once I found one or two, I started seeing more and more close together. Why were they out at 3 in the morning? I'll never understand. Finally, I rounded a corner and passed another one, but this time, there was one ahead of me coming in my direction. I was sandwiched. Just as I was about to pass the oncoming buggy, a pack of dogs howling and yelping ran in front of me. I kept my cool though and maneuvered around them. I was screaming WTF by then. After what felt like the longest trip of my life, I got home. My music never came back on, either. I ran inside, turned on all the lights, and sat in my bed, trying to piece together what the hell had just happened. Right before I called my girlfriend on Snapchat video to let her know I was home, I felt that sensation of being followed creep up again. I tried to shake it off and talk to my girlfriend. After my call, I tried to sleep, but obviously had trouble. Morning rolled around, but I felt different. I felt despondent. That whole week, I felt like a completely different person. My mind kept going back to that drive. But even worse were the dark thoughts. I couldn't control them. I kept envisioning death and murder, things that I would never think of. I couldn't stop them, they would come and go through the day. That Friday, I had an anxiety attack at lunch. I lost control of my actions and found myself holding a knife to my throat, pressed firmly into it. Suddenly I realized what was going on and began to cry. My girlfriend suggested I go to church. Although I identify as a Christian, I don't really go to church and tend to do scandalous things like drink, smoke, etc. I said why not and went that Sunday. I felt fine afterwards. She thinks I was being attacked by something. I feel like that may be true. It was a very lonely, stressful time for me. I was constantly busy, anxious, and even had some heart problems. So I could see why I would be open for attack from a malicious spirit/demon. But then again, what do I know? I realize now that this went on much longer than I intended it, so here. The setting, the mid-1990s. On a rural road in South Mississippi. It was springtime, just a few months before we were to graduate high school and leave everything we ever knew behind. My best friend's dad owned a used car dealership. The previous week, he had gotten a small, sporty Mazda convertible. His dad liked to give his new cars a week or so of running around to make sure he wasn't selling any lemons, so he gave us the keys and sent us off to give it a test drive around the rural backroads of the Pine Belt with heartfelt promises from both of us we would be safe and definitely not speed or drive irresponsibly, a promise we kept to the next intersection before zooming out of sight. We had been driving around for about an hour before coming to this one section of two-lane highway that ran through a floodplain for a small muddy creek. The road was on an embankment so it wouldn't flood every time it rained, so there were steep 15-foot-high drop-offs on either side of the road. There's no pulling over to the side of the road. If you were to break down on this section of roadway. The stretch we were on was straight but had a small hill that crested at about the halfway mark of this half-mile or so of asphalt. We had been enjoying our freedom and breaking promises to his dad, and this particular moment was no different. We quickly ran up to a car that was very likely going the speed limit, but they were driving way too slowly for us in that little Mazda. My friend and I looked at each other with a grin. He downshifted and gave it plenty of gas, eager to leave the slower car in our dust. As we crested a hill, a blur of metal appeared in our lane, barreling towards us at an alarming speed. We weren't even 100 feet from the other car coming straight at us. I distinctly remember the driver in that car bracing himself, his eyes wide, knowing his options for avoiding a collision were 0 to none. My best friend and I yelled "oh shit" in unison as I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable collision. There's no way we could have missed that car. I saw the driver's eyes. He was so close. Impact was inevitable. Except the sickening explosion of metal crunching against metal at high speed never came. I opened my eyes and looked to my left. I saw my friend's arm nonchalantly resting on the door, his mouth open, as he sang along to the Gin Blossoms' Follow You Down. It was a beautiful day, the roof down, the radio blaring. Not a car in sight. Not even the one we attempted to pass. I blinked a few times. I looked again to make sure I believed what I was seeing. Not wanting to hear my friend gloat about how awesome of a driver he is, I didn't ask him how he avoided the other car. He didn't even seem fazed about it. I'm a skeptical man, but that incident was one of two things in my life I simply cannot explain. In our 30s, when we happened to find ourselves in the same town one evening, we met up for beers. Between asking about our careers and family, I brought up the incident again. Remember that time your dad gave us a Mazda to drive around? Remember how we nearly hit that car? He thought about it for a second, and I saw the blood drain from his face. Holy SHT, he said. I remember that. What the hell happened? I told him I didn't know, but I had hoped he would have filled in the blanks. I felt an ice-cold chill race up my spine. This past year, he brought his family to my town for a vacation. They came to my house for dinner, and I wanted to tell our wives this story and have him tell his side of it all. This time, my friend seemed to have no recollection of it, as if his mind had completely erased the experience. Even when I reminded him of our previous conversations about it, he looked at me with a blank stare, as if he had never heard the story before. And so, the mystery of that near accident on the back roads of Mississippi remains unsolved, a strange and inexplicable memory that haunts me to this day. A mystery that seems to get stranger as the years go on. This experience is 100% true, and it still baffles me to this day. A few years ago I went to a small college but got kicked out for bad grades. I was sad that I didn't get to see my friends all the time anymore, but I went to go visit them at least once, sometimes twice a month. At this point in my life, I was truly terrible at taking care of my car, despite how often I was taking the 2.5-hour car ride to see my friends. I would often let the change oil light stay on for 4+ months, just too lazy to take care of it. I'm not sure why I was so careless, but I certainly learned my lesson for it the difficult way. One weekend it was especially important to make it to see my friends because it was my best friend's birthday. Before I left, I remembered that my change oil light had been on in my car for a few months and even considered getting it changed before I made the trip, but I was so excited to get to the party that I promised myself that I would change the oil first thing when I got back. I started the drive a little later than I wanted to, around 6:30 p.m., which would mean I would get to my destination around 9 p.m. The college was located in the middle of a large farming community, so the drive was always lovely and relaxing to me. Long, country roads surrounded by miles and miles of land and crops. I have also taken the drive so often that I knew it like the back of my hand, and I never used a GPS. About an hour into my drive, I was taking in all the scenery as it was turning dusk when all of a sudden my car started to swerve on me. It was like the car was losing traction, and I was losing slight control of the steering in the process. I started to drive a little slower, thinking that it was strange. But there was nowhere to stop, and I had about an hour and a half more to my friend's apartment. I had a bad feeling in my gut that told me to turn around and drive the 30 minutes back to town to get my car looked at, but I knew that most of the places in that town were closed and I would probably end up wasting another hour. I made the decision to risk going the other hour and a half to make it to my friend's apartment and have my car looked at first thing in the morning. About another 30 minutes go by and my car starts puttering and the steering is almost non-existent. I was starting to freak out. It was completely dark outside at this point, and I was in the middle of a country road, and I hadn't seen another passing car since I had gotten on the road. I was thinking to myself how my friends would have to make an hour drive to come pick me up if my car were to just completely die on the side of the road. I reached for my phone to let a friend know what was happening and if someone could get me if worst came to worst, but then I noticed that my phone was on 2%, and this was before I had a car charger. I panicked and tried to make the call before my phone died, but it ended up dying by the second or third ring. At that moment, I knew that I was completely screwed. I was fairly certain that my car was going to die at some point within the hour. It was steadily getting harder and harder to steer, and just with my luck, it started to rain. Not only did it start to rain, but it was a serious thunderstorm that seemed to start out of nowhere. I remember right in the middle of this I started praying. I started praying so hard while crying and just saying, "Please, car, make it there, please make it there, I just need to make it there," over and over again. I looked up for a second and realized I was not 100% sure where I was. It was the storm combined with the darkness that turned my once familiar territory into just nothingness. I couldn't recognize any turns, and I was frantically trying to look for anything, any landmark that struck me as familiar to me. I was completely and utterly frantic at this point, pleading with the air that I just get there safe and sound and in one piece. Then all of a sudden the storm started to lighten up, and I could finally see out the windshield again. I started driving a little ways, and I saw a turn for a highway. I was confused as I didn't realize that there was a highway around that area, but I figured that in my frantic state I made a lot of weird turns that I wasn't used to and found a road to a highway I've never seen before. I decided to take my chance on the highway so I could find somewhere that had a phone at the very least so I could have a friend come pick me up. When I got on the highway, I drove slowly, as my car was seriously going to give out at any minute, and frantically looked for any gas station or fast food place. I figured at this point I had about another 45 minutes until I got anywhere near the town of the college. But just as I was thinking that, I saw a very familiar exit sign. It was the name of the college. I was absolutely baffled. I knew that sign. I wasn't even supposed to see that sign on my trip because I took the back roads, but I knew that if you take the highway, you get off the exit, and my friend's apartment is about a minute down the road. The only problem was that taking the back roads and taking the highway took the same exact amount of time, and I still had 40 minutes of my trip that wasn't accounted for since the time was only 8:25. I knew that it was impossible for me to already be at the exit, but I took it, almost hesitantly because I was questioning its existence, like it was going to turn into a mirage any second and I would be back in the middle of nowhere, lost in a terrible storm. As I was driving down the street, I saw my friend's apartment complex. I looked at the clock, the time was 8:27. I was still wondering how I got there so fast. I thought I had accidentally found a shortcut that no GPS knew about and got extremely lucky. I went up to my friend's apartment, and everyone greeted me as usual, mentioning that I got there earlier than they thought. I never told them about what happened, as they are a pretty critical group of people and wouldn't believe me. After that night, I have been trying so hard to find the roads that I accidentally took to get to the highway, and they don't exist. I seriously to this day have no idea how 40 minutes of driving simply vanished. It's not like I forgot it in my memory because of the time. The only supernatural, or glitch in the Matrix explanation that I have is that I willed so hard to get out of that situation that it just happened. Some kind of wormhole that could have teleported me to where I wanted to be? Every time I think about this, it just leaves me with more questions. What happened to me that day? So I was a brand new driver, maybe about 2 months solo and running for Werner. I was on some back roads in the middle of SW Texas, trying to find a place to pull over for a 30. I saw a truck ahead of me pull out of what I call a make a spot area, so I pulled in where they had been and turned off the truck. It was like 75 outside with a light breeze, clear skies, and beautiful weather. So I grabbed my dog to let her out to potty, and we're out around the area around the landing gear when I look up and see a random red light, kind of brake light red, in the distance, maybe 200 to 250 yards out. The area that we parked in had one of those huge 10-foot fences and nothing but those Texas brush trees that aren't very tall. Well, my dog gets done peeing, and we're standing there, and I'm watching this light bob up and down and move side to side in the distance, and I'm thinking it's probably someone on an ATV, or a pickup truck, or something. Whatever. Well, it gets closer, and now there's thrashing sounds coming from the bushes in its direction. Now my dog, Zoe, at the time, was a very sweet border collie. Wouldn't hurt a fly. She ran from most anything, and she was fast, but God forbid you try and break into the truck. Regardless, she's standing there watching this red light bob up and down, and I notice all of her hackles are raised, and I start hearing that low, nasty growl. The kind where you know you're about to get destroyed by a dog. The lights are coming closer now, the sounds are getting louder, but it's not at ATV height anymore. It's maybe 8 to 10 feet in the air now, and it's still moving in a zigzag pattern towards the truck. Well, Zoe barks at it, the light pauses and starts to now come towards us incredibly fast, same zigzag pattern. Being the idiot, I can feel everything in me telling me to run, hide, or escape, but it's just some ass in the middle of the Texas wilderness playing army games or poaching, right? Well, I yell out that I'm armed, don't come any closer, who's there, etc. all the stupid shit. But it just keeps coming. So I'm like, duck this, I'm out. I have to drag my dog back to the truck. She was very well trained on leash and never needed to be told twice, but she is pulling at her leash. She wants to kill whatever the hell is coming at us now. So as the sounds are getting louder and the lights getting brighter, in a semi-panic, I pick up my dog, throw her into the truck, get in, slam the door shut, and slam my hand on the locks just in time for something, a large black shadow with red lights on the front of it to sail over the 10-foot fence and slam into the side of my truck. I didn't want any part of this. I violated my logs and didn't even put on my seat belt. Jamming gears? Oh yeah. We got up to 65 miles per hour very quickly. A few miles down the road, I found a tiny gas station in a one-stop light town that had just enough room for a truck to park, so I could take my 30. Next afternoon, after I had delivered my load, I was coming out of the shipping office and noticed the entire sleeper of my truck, on the passenger side, was dented inwards ever so slightly. I've never found that road. Never found the pull-off. I don't even remember which road it was. But it was one of the weirdest things I've ever encountered. This happened to me about 4 months ago. Me and my fiancée went to Colorado for an anniversary getaway, where I popped the question and asked her to marry me. We're from Kentucky, so it was going to be a 16 to 17 hour car ride. We get there, and it was beautiful and great, and we got engaged and had a good time. So come the day we leave, we get on the road at about 12 and drive through the night. I was about 2.5 hours away from home in the back roads of Indiana. The GPS took us some questionable ways, and I was driving the last leg of the trip while my fiancée slept a little. At this point, it was around 4 to 5 a.m., and the sun was just beginning to rise. As I drove down a narrow, curvy road, I noticed a car had been following me for a while. This made me feel a bit uneasy, especially since I didn't have my firearm with me while we were in Hickville. I thought I was just paranoid and tried to ignore the car. So I see an extra curvy road coming up, and next thing I know, the car that was behind me gets right up on my bumper and flicks their lights on. Not, But 30 seconds later, after coming around a curve, I see 4 sets of tires sitting on the road, kind of like a roadblock. I had no time to stop and didn't plan on it. I ran over the tires and felt a pretty heavy smack and bump. And right as I turned the next corner, trying to speed up and get away from the car still on my ass, I glance over and see about 5 to 7 people crouching on the side of the road in some bushes. The sun was behind them and kind of lit them up. At this point, I know I'm in some type of danger and floor it and start doing almost 100 miles per hour on this curvy back road. When I didn't stop and my tire didn't go flat, the car behind me slowed and eventually went out of sight. My fiancée slept through the whole thing, and when we went to the next gas station to fill up, I saw in all about 5 to 6 nails in all 4 of my tires and a nice chunk of rubber missing. At this point, my fiancée was awake, and the last thing I wanted to do was ruin her engagement trip by telling her what happened. So I never did. I took the car back to the rental office and went on my way. I'm super thankful the car I rented lucky just had 4 brand new tires put on before we left because it was a cross-country trip. I still get chills thinking what would have happened if my tires went flat that day. When I was in my last year of high school, I had my own car, license, a small job, expendable income, and boredom. My favorite thing to do was to go driving with friends at night and just talk as we drove wherever. We live in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has a lot of rural routes that can be a challenge to navigate if you get used to the grid of the cities. Well, 3 of my friends and I were something like 13 miles out from Oklahoma City, talking about Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, which we had just gone to see that night, when we ended up driving through a wooded area. As we drove, we decided we wanted to get food, so I took 2 lefts to head back to the city. I figured that I could make a 3rd left and a right to circle the block and get going back on the road we started on. Only the road didn't turn left again. I went about 3 miles straight, and the road gradually started to curve right. We kept following it for a while, and I noticed that it seemed to have curved too far. It seemed to have curved more than 360 degrees. It was weird, but I brushed it off once the road started to straighten. Finally, I found a proper left turn. We continued on this left for 3 miles, and the trees got denser. I don't know if you have seen this before, but high beams on trees in the fall/winter, when all the trees have lost their leaves, look very creepy. After another 3 miles going straight on this road, I decided to ditch the random roaming and get my phone out to use its GPS. I opened it, and of course, it had no signal. This was actually really normal for that crappy phone. It lost signal if I was in the wrong part of my bedroom. None of my friends had phones with GPSs on them, and they had faint signals, so I decided to just go straight until I found a street sign so that we could figure out an intersection and call someone to help us navigate out. Looking at the odometer on my car, I watched as we traveled 6 miles straight. We never hit a street sign. So, I asked my friends if any of them had any ideas. They said that it would make sense to just go back and make the first right. Okay. Easy enough. I made a 3-point turn on the 2-lane road, and we started back on it. Well, I traveled 15 miles before hitting the right. And my car was finally getting low on gas. If that doesn't sound weird, go back and look at the numbers from before. We made a left, went 3 miles, then another 3, then 6. That's 9. We went 9 miles in one direction, turned around, and then went 15 miles. We weren't just lost, we were confused. My friend Yuvraj said that we just missed it and that we should turn around once more and keep a close eye on the left. Well, we never found a left. We went 5 miles and found the road curving right. The road never curved before. At this point, I'm on the verge of hyperventilating. None of my other friends had much driving experience, one didn't even have a license, so I was the only one that could drive. Duck it, I thought, I'm getting one of their phones, and I'm calling for my mom. My phone still with no signal, I grabbed Yuvraj's phone and dialed my mom's number. She picked up, and I could hear her, but she apparently could only hear my voice slightly, with heavy static. I hung up and called again. Better connection this time. She said that I was probably hitting a fork in the road somewhere I didn't notice and that she would get a map to try to help. She set the phone down, came back with a map, and now she couldn't hear me again. Fantastic, I thought. I hung up, then called her again. We described the road and told her the last road we were driving on, and she told me she couldn't find this road anywhere on the map. Well, my car was really low on gas at this point. I had maybe 10 miles left on it. So I thought it made sense to just keep driving forward until we ran out of gas. So, I told my mom that we could just go forward, and we did. We went 2 miles and then found ourselves on a main road. Finally, we drove a bit further and ended up at a gas station, filled up, and went to Taco Bell. While we were there, I noticed that Nicole, my friend with no license, was quieter than everyone else. I asked her if she was okay. She said yeah, she was. It was nothing, she was just freaked out by the whole getting lost thing. I called my mom and told her we found our way out. I was driving Sweet Hollow Road back and forth roughly 5 times a week with no idea about its paranormal history, and from the first time my GPS directed me to take the left off Jericho, I sensed something heavy. Something dense and cryptic in its twists and turns. I mentioned this to an acquaintance, and they laughed, assuming I knew the lore. Funny conversation. Oddly, a few years ago I'd enrolled in ketamine therapy in Melville. Had to take an Uber home on a snowy day. I'm still in between realms discussing diner etiquette with the Greek Uber driver when we come around a bend to a Suffolk County PD cruiser blocking the road for a disabled vehicle. We are stuck on a slippery downhill, immediately behind us a sharp curve. It's 1 p.m. on a workday, if anyone comes around that corner, they're hitting us. I'm in the back seat, the Uber driver can't decide whether to back up, get out, or just wait. He's tense. I'm communicating with spirits at this point, as my instinct is to get out of the car, but something's telling me the second I put my foot down on the pavement, we'll be smashed and I'm better off in the back seat with my seatbelt on. I'm not thinking very clearly, and it's difficult to determine if I can trust my logic. I was, however, certain an inordinate amount of time had passed and not one car showed up behind us. At least 10 minutes. I traveled that road enough to know the traffic rate, and this was beyond an anomaly. Eventually the disabled car was restarted, the path was cleared, and we were on our way, where I was soon warned never to go to the Golden Coach Diner for reasons unspecified by my discerning Uber driver. But his tone was serious, and I took it as gospel. From that point forward, the heaviness of Sweet Hollow lifted. It became a kind of storybook path, revealing the particular nature of each of the 4 seasons. In conclusion, ketamine should be considered holy water 2.0 moving forward. The Catholic Church should strongly consider adding it to their exorcism war chest and stay away from the Golden Coach Diner at all costs. This is a true story. In the summer of 2018, I was in my early 20s, and I lived in a small town in British Columbia, Canada. I was living in a basement suite, and I spent the day with one of my lifelong best friends. It was sweltering out, well, in BC standards, it was boiling. Sunny, and 23 degrees. In my small town, there were only 2 traffic lights, and on the outskirts of the town were fields, rivers, and mountains. My best friend and I loved to drive around the endless back roads, windows down, listening to music, talking, and laughing. That was our activity for the day, and it was the perfect one. As the sun had set, we found ourselves parked along one of the small farm roads, laying on the top of her old, beat-up SUV, listening to the frogs and the crickets. We were still pretty energized and didn't want to go back to my place to settle down just yet. So, we decided to go down one of the roads that had a no-exit sign. I had been living in that small town for about 4 years at that point and had never made the effort to go down it. When you're at the entrance of the road, you can't really see the end, but you know that there's no other way to exit, so there was never really any reason to go down there. This road ran along the main river that ran through most of BC, so there was a bit of overgrowth on the road from the plants that thrive from the hydration of the river. As we make our way down the road, she turns down her radio, just to enjoy the silence of the night as we drive. We come to a bend in the road, and we see a car parked on the left side of the road, hugging the ditch that runs alongside it. As we pass the little car, we see a woman sitting in the driver's seat. Her car is on, but it's idling. We can see her face from her lit-up dashboard, and she's looking straight ahead, a completely vacant look on her face. She's sitting all the way back in her seat, but her hands are outstretched, gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white. We think it's a little weird, but we don't slow down, we just continue driving down this tiny road. At some point, it turns into gravel, and there's an abundance of potholes in the ground. The road isn't straight anymore, it's twisting and turning. We pass a truck, not a massive one, but still bigger than an early 00s Ford Ranger. We see that there's a man in the driver's seat, sitting exactly like the woman in the car. His eyes were vacant. We start to get a little weirded out, but we continue on, hoping that the end of the road is going to be coming up soon so we can turn around and leave. We pass yet another vehicle, the same thing as the last 2. The more we drive, there's fewer gaps in between the vehicles. Suddenly, there's a row of them, all filled with a single driver, staring straight ahead and gripping their steering wheel. We're definitely freaked out at this point. My friend asks me, should we turn around now? I tell her, we should. So, as we're driving a bit more, looking for a little bit of room for her to turn the vehicle around, we come to a big clearing, surrounded by trees. The clearing is mostly empty, until we see a flickering light to our right, near the trees. We decide not to investigate the small flickering light, and she swings the SUV around to leave. As we're turning, we realize that the small flickering light that we saw was actually a raging fire, but it was just blocked from our view by people standing in a circle around the fire. They all turn to look at us as we're turning the vehicle around. They all stare, unmoving. We see that they're all wearing black cloaks and various black masks on their faces. Sort of like Death Eaters from Harry Potter, but the hoods on their cloaks weren't pointy, more Red Riding Hood style. I don't remember when she rolled up the windows, but I'm glad she did because at that point we just started screaming and yelling, "What the duck?" as we're gunning it out of there. She speeds down the road, and we pass all the vehicles with people in it. I look out my window and notice that they're all still staring straight through their windshields. As the gap between vehicles grows, I see that the man in the truck has his head turned to us as we pass him. Once we do, we're about 20 to 30 feet away from him when I see headlights behind us. We're still swearing, yelling, and somewhat laughing, not because it was funny, but because we didn't know what else to do. We pass the no exit sign, turn down a random road, and we see that the truck is following us. We make a series of turns and drive up one hillside and down another, and he's still following us. At that point, we're almost in hysteria because we have no idea what we should do next. We pass one of the many farms, and I see that one of them has its property lined with tall hedges. I tell her to go onto the property and hide her SUV behind one of the hedges that also has a barn behind it. She didn't want to go into the person's driveway, so we found one of the field entrances, and she rolled the vehicle into the space between the barn and the hedge. She then opens her door, and I do the same. We sit for a second before we hear a truck slowly drive down the road. She goes to one of the hedge breaks to look through the bushes to see if it's him, and it was. She comes back to the vehicle, and we sit in our seats, with our doors open. We stayed parked there for a long time. For the most part, we're quiet, with the exception of the occasional whispered "what the duck was that" or "what just happened?" We can still hear the truck driving along the flat roads that go around the various fields and farms. She gets on top of her SUV and stands there, looking around, trying to see where the truck is. We didn't realize that when trying to lose the truck, we ended up near the entrance of that road, just a few fields over. She tells me that she sees the truck go back down that road, and she watches it disappear. I lived in that little town for about another year, and I saw that truck drive by my workplace from time to time. I don't think he knows that I worked there, but every time I saw his very recognizable truck, I always got a bit anxious. A few weeks after that happened, my friend's SUV kicked the bucket, and I was thankful that every time she came to visit, her vehicle wouldn't get recognized out in front of my house. At my work, there were a few teenagers from the local high school that worked there, and one time I overheard them talking about whispers of a cult that operated out in the outskirts of town. They were saying that the local legend is that the cult that people had heard about was a cult that had started up just before the town had been founded and disbanded shortly after people started moving to this little town. They said that they heard that this new cult was a new generation of the same people from centuries ago, and they're continuing the traditions of their ancestors. Whatever that may be. I never heard anything more about this cult after that shift, and I never talked to anyone in the town about what happened. The town I lived in wasn't for lower classes. Everyone who owned a house, property, or farm in this town was all stinking rich, and the majority of them had been living in their homes for generations. Thankfully, the owners of the basement suite that I lived in had built and moved into the small town about 30 years prior, and they were a lovely retired couple who traveled a lot and weren't really home a lot, so I didn't have to worry about them. A little side note, not that I think it has to do with the cult or anything, but there's a big graveyard in the middle of the small town, where I would hang out by myself as a teenager, and I got to know the people who were laid to rest there. During my visits, I noticed that there were quite a few people with a Freemason insignia on their headstone, with the last names of the people I'm familiar with today, whose family had been living in the small town since it started, or maybe even before that. And that graveyard is always foggy, like there's a fog machine that operates 24/7 but there isn't one. I asked one of the workers there one time, and he said that they didn't have a fog machine, and he thought it was pretty funny when I asked him. But he also confirmed that in his 17 years of working there, he rarely saw it without the fog. Even in the summertime. He thought it had something to do with the proximity of the river and lack of foot traffic moving the air around. When I was 16 years old, we permanently moved to another state from the Bronx, New York. About 6 months in, I made associates. We were all together until the male associate attempted to seduce me. I politely declined, which somehow turned into a huge argument, and he refused to drive me home. None of the other associates had their own vehicles, and being from the city, I stormed out of the house and walked down this road where it's near retail locations. This incident occurred late at night on a weekend. However, I didn't realize it was really late since I didn't own a car and my parents were strict about curfew. I tried to walk home. At this time my battery died from my flip phone, yes, that old. The area we resided in at the time had no bus lines, no taxi, no train. Straight up boonies. I was not very familiar with the environment, but I did remember a bridge, which would be a good sign I'm on the track since it's the only bridge from that area. I was not. No bridge. The streetlights became dimmer as I walked. So I stopped, and while I was standing on the sidewalk thinking, a small, burgundy pickup truck pulled to the side. A Spanish man asked, "Do you need a ride?" I'd why on earth I said yes. I'm from the city. This never happened before. Maybe I was not thinking clearly from stress due to the argument, lost, phones dead, no payphones, and possibly in trouble if I don't get home. My body hopped in the truck before I could process clear thoughts. Right off the bat, I felt an extremely weird vibe from the guy. I gave him an address, 1 block away from my house. Park, so he didn't know where I live, and I didn't tell him it was Park. As I scanned my eyes cautiously without making it obvious. The interior of his truck was filthy. Exactly how horror flicks are shown: dirty food, clothes, cups, and bottles everywhere on the floor, dashboard, and on the middle seat that's between me and him. The funk was real. His appearance, dirty. As if he were dipped in mechanic oil. I controlled my breathing and counted slowly in my head to not freak out. I looked at my passenger door, and it was unlocked. Thank God. Now all I need to do is wait for a landmark safe enough to run, I said to myself. Soft Spanish music was playing on the radio, and he asked me weird questions. Do you live on your own? What kind of men do you like? Do you think you'll do me a favor, since I'm doing one for you? I skipped the other questions and asked, what kind of favor? Get your mail? He chuckled and showed off his dirty teeth. My heart was pounding. I didn't want to throw myself out of the car to an unfamiliar area. Finally, I noticed a Dunkin' Donuts my parents go to every morning for their coffee approaching. Now, my father did all the driving and I remember this section because my parents love their coffee. You can turn left at the street light, I said. He looked at me and said, I have to stop at my house first, it's just up ahead, it won't take me long. The road he referenced was straight ahead, quiet, no lights up a hill, you can't see anything once you pass the hill. The street light turned red, and I bolted out of the truck. He tried to run after me, and luckily 2 grown men standing outside of Dunkin's saw me running. One man quickly escorted me inside Dunkin' Donuts. The workers locked the store and checked on me. The other guy chased the Spanish man. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see his license plate, but he sped off to the hill. I was shaking and couldn't breathe. It seemed I lost my voice for what felt like forever. I told them what happened. I was ashamed and embarrassed, not because of them but because of me. I never did anything like that. One person said, you were very smart to trust your instincts and escaped when you did. The second person said, God knows what would have happened up that hill. I was shaking so bad. I tried to drink some water. They all walked with me outside and said they'd pay for a taxi. I hugged them all and thanked them for helping me. Both men who were outside when I ran and a female worker that was inside the Dunkin' store drove together to follow my taxi cab. They dropped me off at the park. We said goodbye, and I thanked them again. I'm forever grateful for those people. My house was not far, about a few minutes away. I quietly walked inside the house. Everyone was asleep. All lights are off. As I was about to close the front door, I looked back outside, then I asked myself, what was I thinking? Thank God, I'm still here. I've been with my fiancé for 12 years. I told him about this. He was thankful I acted on instinct. Now I live in the same state, in a different county. I'm more familiar with the areas now. But whenever we pass that section where I could have been close to being the next Elizabeth Short, Black Dahlia. Every day, I regret putting myself in that situation. But, thank God for my instincts and those people at Dunkin's. Who protected me. My parents don't know what happened. Never dismiss your instincts. I still ask myself, what was I thinking? I've been lurking here for a while and thought I'd share a strange experience from about 7 years ago that's been haunting me ever since. I've been a trucker for over a decade, and you hear all sorts of stories on the road, but this one still gives me chills. I was driving through a particularly desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest when I decided to pull over at a truck stop for the night. The place was rather rundown, and there were only a few other trucks parked there. As I was getting ready to settle in, I overheard a couple of guys talking near one of the trucks. They seemed on edge, whispering urgently. I caught snippets of their conversation and heard one of them say, "Watch out for the lizards." I thought it was a weird thing to say but didn't believe much of it at the time. I figured it was some local slang or inside joke. As the night wore on, I started to drift off, but then I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. It was strange because it didn't sound like just one person. It was like a small group was walking around, but the pattern was irregular and unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, so I peeked out of my window. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but there were definitely figures moving around the parking area. They seemed to be skulking between the trucks, almost like they were looking for something. I told myself it was probably just other drivers stretching their legs, but the unease wouldn't go away. Suddenly, I heard a sharp knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat. I glanced at the clock, it was well past midnight. I called out, asking who it was, but there was no response, just the sound of footsteps shuffling away. At this point, I was too spooked to investigate further, so I locked my doors and tried to get some sleep. Just as I was drifting off again, I heard a low, hissing sound coming from somewhere nearby. It was faint but persistent, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was my imagination, but then I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Throughout the night, I could hear knocks and scratches on the other trucks around me. Every once in a while, there was some sort of yelling or moaning coming from the distance, like someone, or something, was trying to communicate or call out. Occasionally, a smoky smell, like a cigarette, would waft through the air when these creatures were close to my truck. The rest of the night was a blur of eerie sounds and creeping dread. I kept telling myself it was just some weird local prank, but the whole thing felt off. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I didn't waste a second. I fired up my truck and got out of there without even looking back. I didn't want to see what might have been left in the morning. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to those lizards than meets the eye. Maybe it was just an overactive imagination, or perhaps there's something out there in those backwoods truck stops that we're better off not knowing about. Stay safe out there, and keep your eyes and ears open. You never know what might be lurking in the dark. There's a certain back road connecting my small town in South Texas to another small town. The drive takes approximately 15 to 25 minutes, depending on your speed. It mostly depends on how fast you want to go. There's rarely any traffic, although there is some, so if you're in a hurry to make curfew, you can get back to my house on this road in roughly 16 minutes. There are houses here and there in a couple neighborhoods far back from the road, and you have to go down relatively long roads to reach them. Not true farms but farm-like homes with a lot of acreage with barns, but not huge actual farms with crops and things all along this road, but there are also stretches of just trees. I've been driven on this road back and forth since I was 9, and when this incident occurred, I had been driving it myself for about a year and a half. I was one of the first of my friend group to get my license, so during that summer I would drive from my town to their town, then back to my town, then back to their town, then back to my town again, then back to their town to take them all home for the night, then finally back to my town to go home. So sometimes back and forth on this road up to 6 times a day, almost every day all summer. During the entire year I took this road for my weekly piano lessons and also for various other purposes, so you get the picture at this point that I know this road very well, I know every single detail, and I could probably drive it with my eyes closed. So I'm 16, almost 17, and it's summer. I've been driving my friends around all day, and it's finally time to go home. I start my way home on this super familiar road at about 9:30. My curfew was 10 p.m. I drove a 1990 Jeep Cherokee at the time. This was 2010, and it was actually super reliable. We all called her Old Faithful because of that reliability. So I'm driving home, everything's cool, but I'm hurrying just a bit to make curfew. Everything seems normal. Until it doesn't. Out of nowhere, I got the strangest feeling, I can't explain it, and nothing caused it. I just felt very out of sorts, not quite panicked, just weird. I noticed that it was dead silent. None of the million loud bugs that come out during the summer in Texas, no wind, nothing. I also saw no deer at all, and on average you'll see like 1 to 6 deer just chilling and or darting across the road every like 5 minutes or so, just tons of deer always. This definitely creeped me out, and I knew for sure something was going on or about to happen. I realize it feels like I've been driving a real long time, even though I knew I hadn't. I glanced at my clock, and it said 9:43. I also looked at my phone to make sure because although my car was really reliable, it was 20 years old at this point, and my parents were very strict about my curfew, so I wanted to just be sure, and also, unexplainably, I just felt the urgent need to make sure of the time. My phone also said 9:43. At this point I'm still sort of spooked and still don't know why, it's just a feeling I get sometimes, and it's almost never wrong. So since it feels like I've been driving for hours and this feeling hit me all of a sudden, I start kind of glancing around and nothing looks familiar. At all. Like I said, I've either driven this road myself or been driven on this road for roughly 7 years, literally countless times. I know every single part of it, so not recognizing anything wasn't normal in any way. Things all start to appear different and just not right in a very obvious way. I truly don't know how I didn't immediately realize it. I try to tell myself you're just tired or you're just stressed about curfew, just chill, so I don't allow myself to think about it too much. This unfamiliar scenery continues. I finally let myself realize this is a problem. I would tell you how long the not recognizing anything began or at what time, but at this point my radio, which I had on playing music, and the clock part of the radio both stopped working and my fully charged phone was dead. Again, my car was super reliable, and the radio/clock had never stopped working before. I got the overwhelming feeling that if I stopped driving or if I pulled over or something, or if I even looked around too much or allowed myself to think about it too much, I'd never make it home. I knew I was no longer in the right place. I had no idea what I meant by this, but it's what I thought and was convinced of, like it was some eternal truth. Bizarrely, I thought to myself, well, I guess I'm in the twilight zone, and I felt serene throughout this whole thing, which is also super out of character for me. I'm usually a pretty anxious person in general, but at this time I felt super chill in an almost disconnected way, so that was strange too. I just knew deep down I had to keep driving. Something kept telling me I couldn't stop. So I did. Hands at 10 and 2 eyes forward, trying my best not to glance around me, but when I did, the lighting was different, the trees and landscape were different, and there was a billboard. I didn't look long enough to make out too much of what it was of, and I most definitely wasn't going to slow down or pull over to get a better look, but it was definitely an old-fashioned advertisement of some sort from, I'm guessing, the 1950s/1960s. It looked brand new, with no signs of aging or weather damage. This area has never had a billboard of any kind, they're not allowed here. Think tiny towns with a back road connecting them in southern TX with barely any houses, just trees and landscape, so I had no clue what that was all about and to this day still have no clue. And when I say the landscape and trees and things were different, I mean that it was an atmosphere I had never experienced before. Another strange thought that occurred to me was that I was on the moon. It was that strange and surreal and entirely different and wrong as compared to that back road I had taken so many times before. I drove for what felt like hours with the deep feeling I was being watched. The entire time I had the inner feeling and impression that I was being observed, kind of like the I'm in the twilight zone and the I'm on the moon thoughts. This thought/feeling that I was being observed didn't feel as though I had independently thought that on my own. Finally, as I was about to become hysterical, which also came suddenly and out of nowhere, like I said this entire time I was eerily calm, I recognized the one stoplight that meant I was entering my town again. The lighting changed and went back to a normal Texas summer night. I could hear the million bugs that come out during the summer in Texas, my radio came back on, and my phone was no longer dead. I made it home and didn't tell anyone. It's so strange because during this weird time/space I was super chill, but I knew that something very abnormal was occurring, without a doubt in my mind, and I knew I had been driving for hours. It almost felt like I was in a trance. And I knew if I stopped driving something very bad would happen. I just kept having the thought, if you stop driving, you'll never come back, and I don't even know what that means. It's like I didn't think it myself but wholeheartedly believed it and took it dead seriously. I don't know what I meant by I'd never come back, but that was going through my head like a mantra nonstop. Since then, roughly 10 or 11 years later, I've of course driven on that road countless times, and it's never happened again. I've never seen the billboard I passed again, and to this day there's never been a billboard out there. I asked super old locals, and they looked at me like I was crazy and laughed, and they confirmed that no, there has never, ever been a billboard out in the middle of nowhere on a back road. I'm not sure where I went that night, but it wasn't in this dimension or reality or whatever you want to label it. When I got to the stoplight and felt relief and got home, and everything appeared to be back to normal, the clock on my radio and my phone both said it was 9:32. I know for a fact I left my friends at 9:30 because, as I mentioned, my parents were super strict about curfew. And I know for a fact that when all of this weirdness began, I looked and it said 9:43 on both the clock on the radio and my phone. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind about the times. I know this isn't a super scary, creepy, or sensational story, but it's what I experienced, and it freaks me out to this day. Writing this all out for the first time ever has actually spooked me, and again, I have that feeling that not only am I being watched, but I'm being observed right now. I still don't know where I was driving that night, where I went, why I went, or what happened, but I do know I was not on that road I've driven so many times before. So this experience begins with me and my now fiancé going to see some local boxing fights about an hour away in the town over from where we live. We get there, the event finishes up, and then it is nighttime when we are leaving, about 9:30 p.m. as usual. There was a lot of traffic, and we got caught on a detour through a part of town that we weren't familiar with but luckily ended up in the area where we are familiar. As I mentioned before, this town is an hour away from ours and has a lot more stores and things to do than our rural town, so we visit quite often. When we left, we made sure to stop and fill up our gas tank and headed out on the freeway back home. This is where things start happening that neither one of us can explain, and we didn't really have an explanation for it until we heard of a glitch in the Matrix experiences. So we were driving for about 15 minutes, and all was well, until our music turned off on the radio. We didn't think much of it because the radio was not the best. So we continue driving as normal, but we both are just kind of quiet. Out of nowhere, I start noticing that it seems like we are driving on the same piece of road over and over, which is weird because we know the road and surrounding area like the back of our hands, so we know when there are turns coming up and exits passing by. There were also no other cars driving by, which is unusual since it is a freeway that is quite busy. While at the same time I start to notice that the gas meter is dropping super fast, like literally while watching, it is just dropping quarter tank by quarter tank until the gas light came on. Actually, in 5 minutes the gas tank emptied. Time is also going super fast, which worries me as well. Based on the clock, it has literally been almost an hour since we hit the freeway, but we both stayed quiet. Finally the radio comes back on, and we are able to see the lights from the gas station that's placed right between the two towns. As I started to put the gas in, it was still empty, no cars in sight, and I was getting this weird feeling that something didn't seem right. So we finish up. I tell her to get home fast because it just felt scary. We make it finally, but the weird thing was that it was 12:30 a.m. when we got home, and we hit the freeway at 10 p.m., so it literally took us 2.5 hours to get back on a usual, sometimes 45-minute drive. To this day we can't explain what happened, and I later found out that she noticed all the weird stuff happening but that we both wanted to stay quiet so we didn't scare each other. Since then I always try to think back to what happened but still have no explanation at all to what could have caused this. Other than maybe entering a different dimension sort of thing or some kind of glitch or something. If you have any ideas or speculation, please let us know, we really want to hear what you think. 9 years ago, during the summer of 2013, my uncle gave me a call one day asking if I wanted to take a road trip with him to Alaska. We live on the absolute southern tip of Texas, right across the Rio Grande from Progreso, Mexico, so naturally I thought he was joking. I mean, it literally takes us 12 hours just to get out of Texas from where we're from, so driving to Alaska sounded insane. However, he was not joking, and about a week later I climbed into his dingy 1990 Chevrolet camper van with my two younger cousins, 13F and 10M, and we headed out on our 3-week excursion. I was a 15M at the time, a freshman in HS, and just excited to see some new parts of the country. It took us about a week and a half to make it out of the US going through northern Washington, but by that time we had been on the road for a while. We were getting a little annoyed being around each other 24/7, and we were generally just trying to hightail it through Canada and get back home in a shorter amount of time. After arguing with my younger cousins for a while, I finally managed to fight my way into the front seat because that's where all us kids wanted to sit, so I officially became the co-pilot. Even though I had an iPhone with GPS, my uncle was an old-school road trip fanatic, so he made whoever was in the front seat use this giant atlas book to give him directions as we drove. This particular night, we had just turned onto Highway 16 in Prince George, Canada, and we were going to be on that road for hours, so I had the atlas open on my lap, but I wasn't looking at it much. It was about 2 a.m. at this point, and my uncle had decided we would just drive through the night to try to make up some time, so naturally I stayed up with him in the front seat to keep him company while he drove. We were just swapping stories and making small talk when my two cousins passed out in the back seats while driving down this fairly desolate highway. At one point, while my uncle was telling me a story and I was looking out the window, I started to become mesmerized by the street lights as they flew by my passenger side window. It was like I fell into this mindless trance of watching a street light go by and mentally counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then another would go by, and I'd restart my counting. I did this for several minutes for no particular reason, but there was something about the perfect yellow illuminated circles the lights would cast against the pitch black asphalt that appealed to me, only to be followed by 5 seconds of unrelenting darkness before the next light would pass. It was soothing. That all changed when, out of my peripheral vision, I could see the next street light coming up, but there was something standing underneath it. I only had about a second to assess what it was, but I very clearly saw a small elderly woman, maybe 5 feet tall at most, hunched over with a red shawl covering her hair and casting a shadow on her face and holding a canvas tote bag that looked like it had something heavy inside. I specifically remember that she was wearing an off-white summer dress that went down to about her knees because it was fairly cold outside, maybe about 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and I couldn't believe she didn't have pants on. Now, seeing this woman didn't necessarily alarm me in any way. It was more the dashboard lighting that illuminates all the gauges for the driver started flickering on and off for over a minute. This definitely got my uncle's attention because running into an electrical issue way out here in the middle of the night would be an actual nightmare. As the lights are flickering, we see a sign that says fuel 1 mile ahead or something to that effect, so he says, "Hey, I'm going to pull in to grab a cup of coffee and fill up." He pulls into this well-lit gas station, and we seem to be the only ones there. He starts fueling up and tells me to stay outside with the kids while he goes inside for coffee, so I stand right outside the van just to stretch my legs and get some fresh air. As I'm standing there, I'm mindlessly looking around, and at some point I start to notice how eerily quiet it is. I hear the faint gurgle of gas pouring into the car from the nozzle. I hear the low hum of the incandescent bulbs overhead illuminating the pumps. I hear the light tapping of some of the larger moths smacking into the glass pane covering those bulbs. There is no other noise, though. There's no cicadas in the trees, cars on the road, bats flapping their wings, air blowing, nothing. It was just unsettling enough for me to become fully aware of how desolate it was out here. My uncle walks back out, puts the fuel nozzle away, climbs back into the car, uncaps his coffee, and just quietly watches the steam cascade off the top of the liquid. I was watching him this whole time because I thought it was a little unusual that he didn't start the car right away, but then he turns to me with a slightly concerned look and quietly says, "Did you see that woman under the street lamp a few miles back?" I actually sighed with relief and chuckled softly because his bringing it up verified that what I had seen was real, and I said, "Yeah, I did, she was kind of creepy," and he gave me a strange, expressionless smile like he was trying to portray calm agreement, but it just seemed off. It seemed like there was something bothering him that he wasn't telling me. Before I could say anything else, we pulled out of the gas station and headed north on Highway 16 as we were before, but slower now because he had a huge cup of scalding hot coffee in his hand, and why he insisted on driving without a lid on is baffling to me. I noticed that the radio had returned to broadcasting faint music instead of static, and there didn't seem to be anything wrong with the interior lighting anymore. I told my uncle, "Do you think that was a coincidence that the radio and lights started malfunctioning right after we passed that lady?" He kept his eyes trained on the road ahead as he grimly said maybe, so at this point I figure he's trying to mess with me by making this seem more unnatural or paranormal than it was by taking on this serious tone. I tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Wouldn't it be crazy if we saw her again up the road?" And I got absolutely no response. Fine. At this point I was slightly paranoid, but mostly just confused by my uncle's demeanor, so I opened the atlas and started flipping through the pages to kill time and maybe find a route for us to take the next day. A few minutes go by, my eyes are focused on the map, trying to make out highway numbers in the very dim lighting of my cell phone screen, and suddenly my uncle says, "No ducking way." The intensity in his voice made my head snap up to look at him, and I see just pure, unadulterated fear on his face as he's looking out toward my side of the windshield and simply says, "The lady." I whipped my head around to see if he was just messing with me again, and I didn't see anything as I looked at the next street lamp in the distance. I looked back and said, "Ha ha, very funny," but he cut me off and frantically said, "I swear to ducking God she was under that street lamp we just passed." Now I was both annoyed and concerned because I was terrified of the paranormal at the time and my uncle is driving, so if he's starting to hallucinate from exhaustion then that's really dangerous. Before I could say anything else, he started slowing down and whipping the van around to start heading down the road back from where we just came, and I said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he didn't say a word, his eyes were locked on the side of the road where he had seen this lady. Right at that point, like clockwork, the radio goes to static again. This sent violent shivers down my spine. I was not comfortable with what was happening, and it is physically impossible for this lady to have moved ahead of us down the road in that amount of time. It was at least 5 miles back that we saw her the first time, and it had not even been 20 minutes. Not to mention that not a single vehicle passed the gas station in either direction the entire time I was there, so she would have had to have sprinted 5 miles in 20 minutes without me noticing her pass the gas station. Impossible. As my uncle slowed down in front of the street lamp where he had seen her, the lights on the dashboard started flickering again, and I felt an overwhelming wave of nausea come over me. I just had a visceral feeling of fear from the entire situation, and I didn't hide it. I pleaded with my uncle to just please turn the van around without stopping so we could get as far away from here as possible, but he was unrelenting. He scoured the wood line with the headlights, hoping to find this woman again, but there was no sign of anything. I put my face in my hands and leaned forward a bit to escape for a couple seconds because, honestly, I didn't want to find out if she was there or not. Right at that moment, through the radio static, we all froze for a few seconds as we heard a crackly disembodied voice say, "Patricia, help." And at that point I started crying. It was too much. There were no more coincidences or explanations for what was happening. I honestly wish I could have passed out from fear to avoid what I saw next. After what felt like an eternity but was actually about 2 minutes, he could not find her, so he started to turn the van around, but this time he did a slower 3-point turn like he was defeated and almost disappointed. I looked back up from my hands, happy to know that we were going to move past this until he made the final small turn to start heading north again, and I almost threw up. She was standing on the side of the road right. Ducking. There. No more than 20 feet in front of the van. My uncle let out a duck loud enough to wake up the kids, whom I had forgotten were in the back by this point, so when I heard a faint female's voice say "What's wrong?" from right behind me, I literally had to summon all my willpower to keep myself from pissing myself. I screamed like a child and jumped up high enough to hit my head on the roof of the van, closely followed by my cousin letting out a blood-curdling scream once she noticed the lady on the road. The inside of that car was pure chaos for about 10 seconds. It wasn't until we both noticed that my uncle had not floored it yet that she said, "Papa. Drive." And I could not have agreed with that statement more. He had just started pressing down on the pedal when this woman, in the most inhuman and contorted movements, lifted her head just high enough for the streetlight to illuminate her completely blank, stark white face. There was nothing on it. No mouth. No eyes. No nose. It had deep, shadowy wrinkles and 2 shallow recesses where eyes should be. I started gagging. My cousin started bawling uncontrollably. The younger male cousin let out the most pitiful and fearful moan I've ever heard before. And finally, my uncle floored it. I had this deep sense of dread that in that moment the van was finally going to shut down, and at that point I would probably just die from fear. It didn't, though. We peeled out of there as fast as that old van would let us, and we just drove. We drove in stone-cold silence, not saying a word to each other, not looking at each other, and just praying for morning to come so we could try to forget what we had just witnessed. None of us ever talked about the night after. The rest of the trip seemed to go by in a flash, but it wasn't the same. There was a palpable tension the entire time from each of us just wanting to get back home and forget all about it. On our way back, we made it a point to drive down Highway 16 in the middle of the day, and we were speeding the entire time. I had been keeping a daily journal of our trip so I could go back and reminisce years later, but I didn't write anything about that night because I knew I would never forget. I couldn't forget. It wasn't until years later when I started to become interested in true crime podcasts and narrators on YouTube telling scary stories that everything changed. I was driving home from Austin alone one day, which was nothing unusual for me, and I was listening to some serial killer podcast. I have no idea which killer they were talking about at the time, but during the two hosts' banter about how this particular killer would target women and then dump their bodies along a highway, the other host said, "That kind of reminds me of that one highway in Canada where the same thing happened, you know, they called it the Highway of Tears or something. I think it was Highway 16 or 17, or something." When I heard him say Highway 16, I nearly crashed my truck because my arm that was holding the wheel jolted as I got a rush of fear through my entire body. I immediately pulled over on the side of the road and Googled ghosts of Highway 16 only to stumble on this article, from New York Times. Look it up. I have honestly never felt that sick in my life. I had long since pushed that memory out of my mind, so it never even occurred to me to research if other people had similar experiences on that stretch of road. Even if it had occurred to me, I don't think I would have wanted to search for it because it would have made the experience all the more real. It took me 5 separate attempts to get through that article because the first time I felt tears welling up in my eyes as soon as I saw the photo of the highway. That was the last road trip I ever took with my uncle and cousins. When I'm in my hometown driving around at night, I have a perpetual anxiety that on some lonely street she might reappear, and this time I won't have anyone there with me. Now I don't know if Patricia is one of the victims of that highway or someone to whom a victim was calling out for help, but I don't intend on researching any further. May she and anyone else who met that fate rest in peace, but if not, I just pray to God she stays on Highway 16.